Oregon still doesn't have a wide receivers coach. Does Dan Lanning need to get on that?
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Plenty to get to today. A timeline for a national championship run. 2026, 7, 8, 9, never. Hey, look, anything can happen, folks. And Rashad Samples, something to keep an eye on there, including the fact that this episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, Oregon doesn't currently have a wide receivers coach. On yesterday's show, Brian Smith, our Locked On recruiting guru, said he thinks Rashad Samples will be the wide receivers coach. That could make plenty of sense. He's coached wide receivers before. He just helped bring in the highest rated wide receiver ever in the history of Oregon football, that being DeCorian Moore, of course, who I think sees the field, at least in a pretty solid capacity for 2025. But then you would need a running backs coach, of course. But I got to thinking, as the day wore on, does Oregon need to make a move here? Does something need to get announced lest the wide receiver recruiting take a serious hit for 2026? It's still very early overall in the class, but you've seen Oregon with 10 commits in the class of 2026, currently ranked number one nationally. I don't know that that's necessarily going to last. Illinois currently has a top 10 class, so I wouldn't put a ton of stock just yet in where those recruiting rankings are, but Oregon certainly is off to a strong start with their 2026 recruiting class, and they don't have a wide receiver commit. There are only two guys, really, that they've been closely tied to. One is Chris Henry, the five-star top receiver who is committed to Ohio State. No surprise. The other guy is Jabari Mack, who Ohio State is also after with a couple of other schools as well. Texas is one of the schools in the mix there for Mack. And when you go on 24/7 Sports and look at Mack's recruiting profile, Oregon is one of the teams that's listed as quote-unquote warm, meaning they've offered, and 24/7 has reason to believe that a stronger connection has been made than a bunch of the other schools that have offered Mack, of which there are dozens, of course, for a guy of his caliber. His composite rating on 24/7 is around 96, 97, in that sort of range. But what he doesn't have in the Oregon profile there is a primary recruiter. Now, that doesn't mean that coaches aren't in contact with him, or that he's, not going to choose Oregon because they don't have a receiver coach right now. He might be waiting to see who Oregon's receiver coach is to see if the Ducks continue to get a chance as you progress throughout the recruiting season into the summer months. But overall, yeah, at some point, a wide receiver coach move has to be made. Last year, when Oregon had a defensive staff change, they switched Chris Hampton from coaching just the corners to the entire secondary, in addition to being the co-defensive coordinator. You can't really do that. At least I haven't seen an offensive staff do that, where you say, yeah, Rashad Samples, you're coaching the running backs and the wide receivers. Those are two different positions that pay anywhere at Oregon, based on my understanding, from $600,000 to $1 million a year. So I don't think you're condensing all of those responsibilities into one particular guy. Now, Samples might be the most logical choice to be Oregon's wide receiver coach. And do you need to go on a rapid pace to make a hire here, to make changes, to settle things down, to get after these kids? I don't have any firsthand knowledge to indicate that that's necessarily the case. I think logically it makes sense that you would want to have a wide receiver coach eventually. If you want to, bring in wide receivers for a given class, you want kids to be able to form a relationship with the guy who's going to be their position coach in college. But I think we're still early enough to where Oregon can, wait, maybe not till the end of the month, but maybe for another week or so before they make this hire. I haven't heard or seen anything with regards to, what this transition could be like and who Dan Lanning wants to hire, which makes me think that Samples would be the leading in-house candidate for Junior Adams' vacated position now with the Dallas Cowboys. But then you would have the running back coach vacancy. And if you're thinking about it in the terms of the 2026 class, Oregon's running back commit is Tredarian Ball. So if you keep the guy that, recruited him as the position coach on staff, probably have a good chance to keep him committed. Ball is a freakishly good athlete who can line up in the slot. Gives some DeAnthony Thomas vibes. I don't know that there will ever be a recruit who I will one-to-one compare to DeAnthony Thomas because he was unlike anybody else. When he arrived on campus, he just moved like nobody else ever did. But, or at least no one that I have seen since. Guys have come close. Guys have been fast and explosive. No one's ever been as twitchy as DeAnthony was. But the other thought that I had, and this is going to the extreme, but would Oregon just wait really, really long to get the guy who they feel is the right hire, whether that's for a running backs coach or receivers coach if they promote samples, and just kind of be willing to punt on wide receiver recruiting in a significant way for 2026? That's probably not the option here. That would probably be the extreme end of it, but I don't know that that would even be a completely disastrous situation for the Ducks. Junior Adams left such a strong core of wide receivers behind that, yeah, I'd like to see Oregon make this move because I want them to be able to bring in as many talented players as they can all the time. But do I feel like this is a position group that is just so lacking for talent? And boy, you got to up the efforts and whatnot. Maybe you need to get somebody in there so that you could flip a Chris Henry from Ohio State, which is going to take more than a phone call. But I don't think that, this position group is so short on guys that are in the room or that are going to be in the room that I go, oh boy, this really, really needs to happen. Lanning, what is he doing? He's crazy. He's got to figure it out, man. No, not really. Because here's something to remember. Gallon Bear is still committed to Oregon. He's on a 2-year mission right now, class of 2024 recruit. So when you think about this position group for Oregon going into 2026, remember to factor Gatlin Bear into your discussions. That's a 5-star wide receiver. You've got Decorian Moore on the roster. You'll, I think, have Jeremiah McLaughlin on the roster, Jurion Dickey, Kyler Casper. I mean, plenty of choices there in that wide receiver room. Cooper Perry, Dylan Gresham. Just keep going down the list. So I'd be surprised if Oregon ends up taking 0 wide receivers, especially with how abundant that position group is all across the country. High school football, college football, there's just a lot of talent. Every single NFL draft class, you are seeing, dozens essentially, anywhere from 10 to 20 receivers that get drafted a year that end up being NFL caliber players and good ones as well. It's just a position where a lot of guys go play. There's a lot of money to be made in the NFL for wide receivers right now because it's a passing league. So there are always options. There's always a lot of guys in there. But I think it is reasonable to say, again, taking no receivers other than having Gatlin Bear come in, that'd be the extreme example. I don't necessarily expect that to be the case because it is still the middle of February. But I also think that with the Junior Adams shift, I have my expectations tempered for what that position group is going to look like recruiting-wise for the 2026 class. I don't think you're going to see, Oregon go after 5 blue chip guys and have a, 2025 defensive back level recruiting class, but at the wide receiver position for next cycle. I think that's all it really means right now that they're undergoing this shift. But I'm sure Dan Lanning is plenty aware that this change has to happen at some point, or that the hire has to happen. And the more I think about it, the more I think I'd like to keep Rashad Samples on staff. I'm going to talk about him more later on today's show, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter. I have many a time stated that I don't have the same expectations, hopes always, but expectations for Oregon next year as I did this past season. Does that mean my expectations reset to natty or bust in 2026? Complicated question. Easy question though. Should you check out Factor meals? Answer, yes. If you're looking to optimize your nutrition this year, Factor makes eating well easy with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen, and ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences every week, you can customize your meals to fit your lifestyle, whatever it is. Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, Keto, they've got it all. Plus, Factor even offers wholesome smoothies, breakfast, grab-and-go snacks to keep you fueled all day long. I'm a big meal prep guy, and let me tell you, Factor is making this really, really easy for you. Meal prep is great. and Factor's the way to do it. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50 and use code LockedOnCollege50 to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code LockedOnCollege50 at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50 to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Go check out Factor Meals today. Bet since you hadn't seen it in a while here on YouTube that you didn't think second segment sips were happening. Wrong you are. Wrong you are. So, we're all waiting for that national championship season for Oregon, right? Great chance. Unfortunately gone by the wayside at the hands of Ohio State this past year. Hat tip, the Buckeyes were really good. PHLY Rothstein. I don't know if you're related to John Rothstein, but that guy's awesome. He is the one, by the way, who coined the phrase, his name is Dana Altman, and he aligns Rubik's Cubes. Hopefully, Oregon aligns those cubes on Sunday in a win over Rutgers at home. Would really like to have that one. Kind of a must-win. So 2026 Oregon is the year you expect us to push for a national championship. Complicated question. I expect Oregon to have a better team on the field in 2026 than what they will have in 2025 for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're going to be resetting at a lot of positions this year, and I think some young guys are going to fill those roles. And so as they get experience this year, they might make mistakes. They might not be at their full potential yet, but have a chance to get there with a season and an offseason of development going into 2026. I'm thinking about guys like Dacorian Moore. I'm thinking about guys like whoever emerges in the back end of the secondary, whether it's an Aaron Flowers, a Trey McNutt, Naeem Offord, Brandon Finney, Dorian Brute, just keep going down the list. Some collection of those guys are going to be playing this year, but are they going to be the best versions of themselves across the board? No. Dante Moore, same thing. I think he can be better this season than what he was as a true freshman at UCLA. But if he were to start at Oregon for 2 years, which season you think is going to be better? I'm going to go with the second one. That's been the case for, every other quarterback in the history of football pretty much. Not all of them per se, but at Oregon, the quarterbacks have progressed forward, which is what happens when you have good resources and support around a quarterback, things like, offensive line, run game, receivers, that sort of stuff, and a good coaching staff as well, which I think Oregon has. So I just see so much new coming in this year that it's hard to see, for me, all of that coming together and crystallizing into Oregon's first national championship. In 2026, though, if Dante Moore comes back, the offensive line, which they have recruited well in the last couple cycles, should still be good. Defensive line, you'll lose Mateo Uyunglele. You might lose a Kenyon Sadiq to the NFL draft if he really pops this year. Individual guys, I'd love to have him back. If you got Mateo to come back for a fourth year, chef's kiss. That would be something else for the defense. It would take a large NIL investment, and I think he'd be worth it. But whether or not he would accept it is a different question. So there are some examples like that, but with the way Oregon has recruited this year overall, I think that 2026 roster can be crazy talented. That's when, the 2024 class, I think you will have kind of filtered through and figured out, okay, who are the impact guys? Where are they playing? Where do you have portal needs over here? But there's so much talent in that class. I think a lot of them are going to be able to shine through in 2026. So that is the year. But on the flip side, that's a year, I should say. That's a better year for what Oregon's going to put on the field. I expect the Ducks to have a very good record this season, but I don't put the same ceiling on this year's team until they prove to me otherwise that I had on this past year's team. But the Oregon schedule in 2026 also makes that complicated. This is why I say it's a better opportunity in my view. The schedule gets more difficult in 2026 because Oregon is back to having Ohio State and Michigan on the schedule, but they have to go to Columbus, and Michigan comes to Autzen Stadium. No one would ever have to go to both of those places or any athletic department, literally any of them. I imagine in the Big Ten, if they have to do that, would probably complain to the Big Ten and say, what the heck is this? If it has happened before, then I imagine there was a phone call between the AD and the conference commissioner going, yo, what the heck is going on here? So those are 2 road games. They also have to go at USC, Hard to tell how challenging that's going to be, or if Lincoln Riley will even be their coach by the time that game rolls around. We don't have a date for it just yet. They have to go at Illinois and at Michigan State and at Oklahoma State. So those are the road games that Oregon has. Ohio State, obviously the toughest one in the horseshoe. But hey, what's the horseshoe, you know? I mean, regular season against Ohio State, Oregon's awesome. It's that postseason element that the Ducks are still working on there. By the way, fun fact, in 2026, Oregon opens with Boise State. That's never gone wrong before. That always goes well, which will be really, really fun. But then the home slate that year is Michigan, Nebraska, Northwestern, UCLA, and Washington in the Big Ten, with Boise State and Portland State as well. So overall, yeah, Oregon's probably favored in most of those games. Not Ohio State, but probably every other one in there. Would they necessarily win the Big Ten championship? Maybe not. If they go to Columbus and lose, and the Buckeyes will be really good that year, and they'll have a 5-star quarterback probably in his second year starting for their team as well. But as we saw this past year, you don't have to win the Big Ten to win the national championship. Sometimes 10-2 with a home playoff game is the way to go. So it's, of course, matchup dependent with regards to who you get in the college football playoff. And by 2026, by the way, might be a 14-team playoff. Yeah, I do find that repulsive. But college football is not asking me what I want. It just goes about its business that way. So overall, yeah, I like Oregon's chances that year. I like the team. I do want to see, where they match up with people. When do you play Ohio State? Obviously, Washington will be the last week of the regular season, but all we know from a schedule standpoint is Boise State at Oklahoma State and hosting Portland State. I think that's 3-0 in the non-conference, and then you would then have to go 7-2 rather in conference play, and you're into the playoff. You probably have a home playoff game. Maybe you just barely have a road playoff game, but you get in that spot, that's anything could happen. You can get hot, which is not something you used to be able to say. You used to have to be hot the entire season, but Ohio State showed us this past year. You just get in the playoff, just have a shot. And I fully expect Oregon to get into the college football playoff in 2025, but I expect them to get there in 2026. And I think that team, if they make the right roster moves, the right portal additions, and develop some of these guys that have mega potential on both sides of the ball from their 24 and 25 recruiting classes, then yeah, I think that year is a better opportunity. But there are a lot of factors that go into, are you going to win the national championship? So I hope that answers your question there, PHLY Rothstein. Fly Rothstein, Philly Rothstein? I don't know exactly what you're going for there. But could Texas be going for Rashad Samples? Well, unfortunately, that could make some sense. First, this episode brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action just getting started. There's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your bets into a same-game parlay. Plus, if you want to bet college football because you love it so much, which you probably do if you listen to or watch this show, then you can bet win totals. Oregon's is 10.5, tied for the highest in the country. You can bet conference championship odds. Oregon's second. National title odds. Oregon's top 5. Everything you want, FanDuel's got it. That's the way they roll. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So Texas saw its running backs coach depart. And if your first thought is, wait a minute, doesn't Rashad Samples have ties to Texas? You are doubly correct. So he's not just from there. He went to Skyline High School in Dallas. He has also coached on Texas's staff, pre-Steve Sarkisian, of course, back in 2018, but he also spent 3 years as an assistant coach with SMU. So that's his home state. Yeah, it would make plenty of sense for him from that standpoint to go over to Texas. Here's the other reason why this is something I will be monitoring heavily in the coming days. After Oregon already lost one great recruiter in Junior Adams to the Dallas Cowboys, I would really hate to lose a second great recruiter to Texas. Now, I have not yet seen a report or heard directly that Texas is going to pursue him. I'm just saying that that makes plenty of sense. And if I were Texas, you know who I'd be going after? Rashad Samples. Now, maybe he's currently interviewing for the Oregon wide receiver coach job, and he'd rather coach receivers than running backs. But if his desire is to go back to his home state, that's a tough thing to pull away. You know, Mario Cristobal liked Oregon and would have stayed amidst other job, or other schools wanting him as their head coach. But it was Miami, and that was going home, and you just can't get past that. So, end of the day, yeah, I could see him going over there. You'd be going to a high-level program that, like Oregon, is humming along. They're not looking for their first national championship. They haven't won one in about 20 years, but their program, like Oregon, really strong. Good head coach, recruiting at a high level, and they run things the right way to put a quality product on the field year in and year out. They're the only program in the country to reach the college football playoff semifinals in each of the last 2 years. They did it in the 14 playoff, and then they did it this past year after scraping by Arizona State in the quarterfinal round. But yeah, I could see him leaving if that's. I think the hometown desire or being closer to home would be a stronger pull than, well, Texas is just light years ahead of Oregon. Like, no, they go after the same sorts of kids. They recruit at the same kind of level. They're both competing for conference championships in the two biggest and richest leagues in the country. So I think there are plenty of similarities between Oregon and Texas right now. But my concern level out of 10, just gut reaction when I saw Texas is losing its running backs coach, about a 7.5, 7.5 out of 10. That it went off in my head of like, that could make a lot of sense. Really hope that does not happen there. But if he wants to be the wide receivers coach, then Oregon is going to be the place for him. But once you've lost Junior Adams, yeah, I'd go after Samples, or else we'd be asking major questions about Oregon's wide receiver recruiting for the 2026 cycle. So hopefully that does not come to fruition there. A couple things to wrap up today's show. First of all, Pete Nakos of On3, per an anonymous SEC staffer, and Nakos is a pretty big name in the reporting world, so I tend to trust what he says. According to the staffer he spoke to, again, anonymously, make of that whatever you will, Oregon is not in the top 5 in financial expenditures on their 2025 transfer portal class. Texas Tech is in the top 5, and Texas Tech was referred to here in a quote that they kind of effed everything up because they're spending so much. And by the way, I talked about this recently on Locked On College Football. Texas Tech is upping the ante in a big way over in the Big 12 to be all in on athletics, to make the sort of commitments that they feel are required to compete at a championship level. They have a top 5 transfer portal class in 2025. It's not by accident. Where's the boogeyman allegation? Where's the Texas Tech is ruining college football with money? Where's the Texas Tech is just all this stuff? This is just another data point, reminder for all of you Duck fans out there that if you ever come across that online or in person, there are a lot of schools that spend a lot of money, but Oregon will take an outsized amount of flack for that because Phil Knight and Nike are just an easy, low-hanging fruit boogeyman target. I see these examples, I feel like on a weekly basis, I bring them up on the show so that you can be loaded with all the ammunition you could possibly need. You're upset that Oregon's just buying their class. Well, what about Texas? What about Texas Tech? What about Texas A&M? What about how much Ohio State spent? Just keep going down the list. Just keep going down the list. So I found that interesting. Last thing here this week, this is from DuckRon626. Penn State has a tough road game at Iowa for one of their tougher games. I understand that. But Oregon also has a game at Iowa, but you don't mention that as a tough road game for the Ducks. Why is that? So when I discussed Oregon's path to getting back to the Big Ten championship game next year, I brought up, if you missed the segment, a couple other schedules in the Big Ten for teams that are also going to be pushing for a conference championship this year. That being Ohio State and Penn State, maybe Michigan, maybe Indiana. Indiana has a significantly tougher schedule. They have to go to Oregon at Autzen Stadium, and they have to go to Penn State. Pretty tough. And I think Indiana can be good, but I think they downgraded at quarterback from Curtis Rourke to Fernando Mendoza. Just my personal take. But I'm not the only one that feels that way. But there are those that don't, of course, and we'll just wait for the season to come around to see who's right and who's wrong. So overall, when I was looking at those matchups, I was listing the games that stood out the most, and that game just stood out more on Penn State's schedule than it did for me on Oregon's schedule. I fully expect Oregon and Penn State to beat Iowa because, yeah, their defense is really good. But once again, their offense was better this past year. But they also lose Caleb Johnson, who's one of the best running backs in all of college football and is going to be probably the second, maybe third running back taken off the board this year behind Ashton Genty at Boise State. I think that Iowa game can be trappy, tricky, but overall, I've just never seen them seriously be able to get up to the highest level. You know, they had a season where, you know, I think they went undefeated in the regular season or something close to it and then lost the Big Ten championship game, probably to Ohio State. And then they played Stanford in the Rose Bowl with Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey just torched them. Like, it was not a close game. It was completely uncompetitive. Iowa was a good team, but they were not great. I don't think that as long as Kirk Ferentz is their head coach, they have the ability to regularly challenge. Can they pull the occasional upset of a top-tier team? Sure. Things can get funky in that home field. They've got a great home atmosphere. One of the best in the Big Ten for sure. I mean, there are a lot of great atmospheres, but Iowa's home field advantage is very real. It's a tough place to play. Teams have gone in there highly ranked and lost before. But the lack of consistent explosion on offense just continues to be a recurring theme. And I don't think they've made the necessary changes to suddenly make a jump and be at Oregon and Penn State's level. I think if I were to rank Big Ten teams, you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, 6, 6, and 6, since it's an 18-team Big Ten conference. Yay, realignment. Oregon and Penn State are at the top of tier 1 with Ohio State. Iowa is probably maybe they're maybe at the top of tier 2 or like the middle of tier 2. So, yeah, the road games can get weird, but overall my concern level for Oregon and Penn State in those games is not particularly high compared to some of the other matchups they have. But for Penn State, you know, compared to the rest of the matchups that Penn State had, that was a game that just kind of caught my eye more than the others. So that's why I had it on there. Overall, I don't worry about either team losing to Iowa next year. So that's where we'll wrap up today's show. Hopefully on Monday, I'll be recapping a basketball win. That's on Sunday. Get to Matthew Knight Arena as always against Rutgers, winning that game. Rutgers is just not that good. Like Northwestern, Oregon needs to get out to a hot start, be in control, and stay in control. They do that, I'll feel slightly better, and Oregon will be 18-8. So, at least there's that. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.